Thank you, everyone. I hope everybody enjoyed lunch and had a good time at lunch. I don't know if you've ever been to one of these things before and been backstage, but the lobster and the caviar and the Dom Perignon that they got back there, it is, I don't know if your versions of that was as good, but man, it was tasty back there. So, weren't those morning sessions wonderful? A lot of interesting topics. Some great panelists, some great presenters, just a wealth of information that came out of this morning's sessions, and we intend to keep that into this afternoon here. Specifically, one that I think was really different for this group was the sports panel that we had, the sports topic that we had, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on that, whether it's through a survey or coming up to myself or Michael. Because that is different than what you normally hear at something like this. And if you like that and want to see more of that maybe for next year, please let us know. Michael did this already, but I really want to foot stomp this. I would really like to thank the U.S. GIF Tradecraft and Professional Development Committee volunteers that participated in the planning of this event. Their interest, time, and support were key to making this day what it is. And those volunteers are, again, Michael Hauk, Marissa Hess, Daniela Moody, Stephen Thomas, Chris Faselli, Barry Tilton, Ed Waltzberger, Sherry Olson, and from USGIF staff, Jordan First. So if we could give all those folks a big round of applause for everything they did, I'd really appreciate that. I know you're all excited to get the afternoon session started, but I just want to take another minute or so to do a pitch for the Tradecraft and Professional Development Committee. It is an all-volunteer committee, one of the handful of committees at USGIF. We're always looking for new members to come and join the committee and work on things like planning for this event and other activities that we have going on throughout the year. If you'd like to join, you can see Michael, myself. You can pick me out of the crowd with my lovely jacket that I'm wearing that stands out from everybody else. Or you can go on to the USGIF website. If you go to the Communities tab across the top, and then to the Communities and Working Group sub-tab, or sub-element, and then click on the Tradecraft and Professional Development Committee, there's an email address in there that you can send an email to expressing interest, and that'll reach Michael and I. Or you can attend the Tradecraft and Professional Development Committee fireside chat that Michael and I will be giving at the Innovation Corner on the main showroom floor at 12:50 tomorrow afternoon. We'll be explaining what the committee is all about and taking questions if you have any. You don't have to be an analyst to join the committee. We welcome diverse backgrounds and experiences related to professional development and tradecraft. So the more the merrier, and the more diverse the backgrounds, the merrier as well too. I will reiterate Michael's comments from the earlier panels. You should have cards on your tables, and if you don't, there are some folks, I think primarily in red t-shirts, moving throughout the crowd, and they have cards if you need some. These sessions work really well with your questions and talking about the things that you want to hear about, or hear the panelists talk about, so please be generous with your questions. So with that, the next panel is our Spatial Analytics to Optimize Disaster Planning, Position and Expend Resources, or Predict Stress Points in Overlapping Civil Sectors panel. And I am very pleased to have Mina Chang. She is the CEO of Linking the World and is also an International Security Fellow at New America as the moderator for this panel. Let's all give her a big round of applause. Thank you, Mina.
All right. Thank you so much. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you, Chuck, and to Mike and Ted, and to you all for joining us here at Foreword so that we can speak about the role of spatial analytics in the role of disaster response operations and the role of spatial analytics in understanding where the stress points are during the disaster planning phase. As you get to know our guests, it's really interesting because we've all actually worked in many of the same disasters, but we've worked at it from different perspectives. And so it's going to be a really exciting conversation, I think. There have been some revolutions and innovations in this space, responding to earthquakes and floods and tsunamis and mass tropical storms everywhere from Haiti to Nepal to New Orleans to every city here in Florida. But no matter, we're already using remote sensing techniques and GIS and GNSS tools in pre-disaster mitigation and preparedness, as well as in response and recovery efforts. And we've used spatial analytics. For example, during the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, organizations were using, through public-private partnerships, they were able to translate static maps into dynamic real-time maps, allowing for actionable intelligence. And when they shared it between organizations, it really increased the response times. So by the way, this included data that was made unclassified and available by the NGA. At the same time, organizations were able to use geospatial data to predict the movement, the spread of this epidemic. And so they could help pre-position makeshift medical facilities. And those, by the way, helped through GIS mapping deliver real-time situational awareness. And if you think back to that outbreak, remember how apocalyptic that everyone made it seem like it was going to be. And its impact, though, only hit about 18,000 people, which is still a huge number, but it's very low considering what we were told to anticipate through predictive analytics. Spatial analytics are allowing us to understand the scope of events, but with any kind of breakthrough, there's risk, there are opportunities and challenges. Whenever a disaster hits, we are all hit with a tsunami of raw data. And so what do we do with this? Can we process the data at the speed of collection when we have so much, or does it need to go back to a central point? How quickly can we get the insights to the operator on the ground in a timely, relevant fashion where it's still actionable? I know we've all had times where it comes in and the problem's moved on or it's morphed. So we're gonna look at how we need to look at spatial data infrastructure today. Thankfully, we have 3 experts that can help us dig deep on these issues. First, we have Chuck Delaune, Director of IT for the American Red Cross, Mike Ouimet with the Texas Department of Public Safety, and Ted Okada, who is the Chief Technology Officer at FEMA. So I'd like to welcome you to come and introduce your work and what you're doing and what we should be considering today during our talk. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Mina. My name is Chuck Delaune. I'm with Humanitarian IT with the American Red Cross. These are really exciting times for the Red Cross. You know, we've been around for a while, and we had a disaster relief model that was in place for decades that worked relatively well. It was just expensive and cumbersome and not the most efficient. Well, in the last few years, under new leadership in the organization, we've come light years in terms of what we can do and how we do it, and how we provide assistance to our disaster clients in the aftermath of an event. So I'd like to highlight a couple of our systems that we utilize now. One that's still under development, we're using it, and another that was established a few years ago, and try to talk you through what that means for us and the capabilities that it gives us. So the first is something called RC View, which is actually an acronym that stands for Red Cross Visual Interactive Event Wizard. Yes, somebody spent way too much time on that and probably needed a hobby, but I digress. What it does, it creates a common operational picture using maps and data visualization. We have mobile apps. We can do geospatial monitoring for damage assessment, tracking resources, equipment, supplies, feeding, partner activities. support informed decision-making via situational awareness, data analytics, and information from our partners. In Red Cross, we look at things in two different ways: blue sky and gray sky, with blue sky being the everyday, gray sky being during the time of the event. This system gives us capability to do things in blue skies, like work with our home fire campaign, where we're currently in the process of installing hundreds of thousands of smoke detectors in at-risk homes across the country. It helps us collect information, identify donors, look for opportunities, several things that we do on a routine basis when we're not actively engaged in disaster response. In gray skies, we have the ability to use this information in a real-time fashion. That's what we never had before. We did after actions and hot washes, and to be honest, we looked at what we did last month, what we did last week, to figure out what we're gonna do next week and next month. You know, we suffer the curse of emergency management where we always find ourselves planning for the last big disaster, right? Well, this gives us the ability to look and make real-time decisions with information in a real-time manner, something we never had before. We can use it to collect data and damage assessment information and inform these decisions so we know what we can do today, what's happening as a result, where the trend lines are going up or down, how many people we're feeding and sheltering, where we're distributing supplies and equipment, how many staff we need for what and where. On a disaster relief operation, RCView creates a common operating picture which we never had before, large and small. It can be used productively to estimate outcomes, to visualize actual delivery, plan service delivery, and track locations. The mapping component of this gives us a level of situational awareness we never had. We can look at vulnerability and risk, we can look at resource mapping, and damage assessment data visualization. We have a mobile app called RC Collect. A lot of our folks are using Survey 123. We now have our own branded application in the App Store. And we use this to collect detailed information on damages, use RC Collect to support shelter client registration in the very near future so we can actually start the assistance process when the clients come into the shelter at the beginning in an evacuation phase. The other program that we have is called Volunteer Connection. You know, we've been around since 1881, and for about 130 of those years, we never had an enterprise-wide volunteer management system. We do now. It goes across all of our lines of service, and it helps to have our volunteers be able to self-manage their own profiles, their areas of specialty, and during a disaster relief operation, it helps us manage volunteer resource needs, deploy volunteers, and integrate with our corporate travel office to get people there in an effective and efficient way. On relief operations, we have what we call a Humanitarian IT daily snapshot that we produce. It's a combination using several products: Microsoft Power BI, Esri ArcGIS, RCView, Microsoft Excel, and Microsoft PowerPoint. It helps us produce data and visuals that really tell a better story than looking at a report or a spreadsheet. We're doing business differently. We're starting to do business virtually. We're starting to do things in a lot of different manners that don't require the human resources or boots on the ground for as extended a period of time as we have in the past. Just a couple of examples of what these visuals look like. Here's one that shows staff currently on a DRO, how many open positions are required to be filled, how many have been filled to date, where they are, what this is for, so we know what we need to do. We can look at our burn rates. We can look at how much money we're spending, what the cost of the operation is going to be, what we need to do to move forward. In addition, we can look at hardware. You know, our Vice President of Operations in disaster, Brad Kaiserman, he'll ask me, Chuck, when are we going to run out of Schlitz? Meaning laptops, radios, cell phones, all the hardware it takes, satellite dishes to make the operation work. And we can look at this and know when we're getting close to a point that we're going to have to make some kind of adjustment. So I'd like to close with just a couple of thoughts. As my boss tells people, To put things kind of in perspective, our mission is to help people who have had a really bad day. And having said that, we operate in 3 realms: prepare, respond, and recover. So I'd just like to leave you with a couple of thoughts on that. First, preparedness takes on many forms. Secondly, not to sound like a Geico commercial, but as long as weather reporters continue to make bad decisions during the events, we know we'll have work to do in the forms of response. And then the last thing I'd like to leave you with is in regards to the recover phase. It's all about priorities. That's a real picture, South Louisiana flood, shortly after the Saints won the Super Bowl, at which time hell was, in fact, still frozen over. Thank y'all.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, GEOINT. My name is Michael Ouimet. I work for the Texas Division of Emergency Management. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm manager for the Critical Information Systems Headquarters Group at TDM, and the mission of our section is very similar to Chuck's, and I want to commend him on a really great presentation. I'm not going to focus on everything we do because really many of the things that we do are very similar to Chuck's shop. What I kind of wanted to focus on today with the short amount of time that I have is really what your industry can do for the emergency management industry. And I've grown over the last few years. I've been in the geospatial industry for over 30 years, and the last 4 has been in my present position. And I've grown to really more appreciate what your industry, particularly the advanced 3D modeling and visualization tools, geospatial tools that your industry brings and can add to emergency management. So I want to focus on from a pivot point, a quote that I came across a couple weeks ago when I was reading about the new hurricane model the National Hurricane Center is coming out with. And they were interviewing Kenneth Graham, the director of the National Hurricane Center, where he said a key area is linking the physical science of modeling, in this case hurricanes, to the social sciences that assess human behavior. If we can connect the two, then we can really save lives. And a reflection on that, if you would have asked me 10 years ago about 3D modeling and visualization, I would have said, it's really great, it's great eye candy, but it's not really pertinent to the serious work that I have at hand. But what I've begun to realize is that politicians or decision makers or even the public doesn't necessarily understand two-dimensional maps. They don't understand a flood extent. They may not understand a depth grid. But what they do understand is perhaps the visualization work. And that's very important because we need to make faster, more pertinent decisions for emergency management. I'm going to pivot over and talk about Hurricane Harvey and how that relates to you. So back at the end of August of last year, as you all know, we had Hurricane Harvey roll through the Gulf Coast. And it rolled through as a tropical storm. It picked up speed and then crossed over the Yucatan Peninsula. There it was downgraded to a tropical storm. And as it came out of the Yucatan Peninsula heading north, we thought we were out of the woods with that. But then it quickly started picking up steam as it got into the Gulf, heading north. And then it suddenly pivoted to the east. And it headed along the Gulf Coast. There was a very strong high front in the center of the U.S. at that time that was keeping the hurricane from moving north. So it meandered slowly across the coastline of Texas. And as a result, we ended up with record amounts of rain over the course of several days. And the National Weather Service did a fantastic job as far as predicting the path. They did a great job as far as predicting the amount of rain that we were facing, and they were predicting record amounts. What we weren't able to predict accurately is that with all that much rain, where was it going to go? Because along the southeast section of Texas is a relatively flat area. And so for flat areas, when you have lots of rain, that tends to just lay there. Versus where I'm from, which is Central Texas, which has a defined topography, the water tends to be more predictable about where it's going to go. So we had rainfall of biblical proportions, not a 100-year flood, not a 500-year flood, but a 1,000-year flood. Some people have said it's up to a 5,000-year flood. So the end result was stuff like this, which was Port Arthur at the end of August. And let me go through what that resulted in as far as damage to Texas and for the nation. So Harvey, by the numbers, 68 direct fatalities and 39 indirect. We had approximately 150,000 homes destroyed or damaged. We had approximately 500,000 vehicles destroyed or damaged. We had 17,000 emergency rescues. We had an impact area of approximately 35,000 square miles, which equates to a state the size of Indiana. And then finally, the total damage was still, we're still calculating the numbers, but right now it's upwards of $125 billion, which is at the level of Hurricane Katrina, which is the largest disaster in US history. So where this matters and why it's important is that questions were asked, well, why didn't we just evacuate the entire area? Well, some communities chose to evacuate, some others decided that they didn't have that much time. Going back to that hurricane track that I talked about, normally we have a 120-hour planning period for a hurricane, 5 days. The way Hurricane Harvey got spun up, we had 70 hours. So we were shorted 2 days on our normal planning cycle. So that resulted in many cascading decisions. And also there's a history of mass evacuations in Texas where we've learned the challenges of trying to evacuate a large urban area. Harris County has 4.5 million people. So back in 2005, we did a mass evacuation for Hurricane Rita that was about 2 weeks after Katrina. Massive traffic jams, gas stations ran out of fuel. There were cars abandoned along the road because they ran out of gas. A couple years later, we had another mass evacuation for Hurricane Ike. Again, many challenges, lessons learned from that, and then we had another mass evacuation about a year later for a hurricane that never really hit the Houston area. So pulling the trigger on making a mass evacuation for a larger urban area is not without consequences. There's a lot of money, there's lives at danger when you even try to do an evacuation, evacuate hospitals and nursing homes and so forth. So what's becoming important is, and where your industry really is going to be important for emergency management, is giving us better visualization tools that we can better communicate with politicians and decision makers and the public so they can make better decisions to get out of harm's way. So if you think back on that timeline that I talked about, what if we could have had another day's notice about what was actually going to happen with the flooding? Even if we would have had a few more hours, folks, if they lived in two-story homes, could have got their most precious possessions up in the second story. They could have gotten out of their house, moved their cars, and got their loved ones out of danger. So time really matters in emergencies. So I want to highlight a few programs that are going on that I think kind of illustrate some of the visualization that's going on for emergency management that I think will be helpful for the future. So one is a shout out to the USGS, and they've done, just recently released some geospatial products for the Hayward Fault just outside San Francisco. They've done a really great job with their video clip showing the results of the potential for the Hayward earthquake. They've also done a really nice Google Earth map that shows the fault line over residences and businesses and public institutions so that we can better plan for that major catastrophe that eventually is going to happen for our country. In my own state, a consortium of federal agencies have formed: U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, FEMA, USGS, National Weather Service, some of our state universities, Texas Water Development Board, my agency, to come up with pre-scripted flood models that are tied to flood sensors, so that we're not trying to do live flood modeling, which is a very difficult process to do accurately on the fly. And so as we get information coming in live from the flood sensors, we can pull up the appropriate flood model to replicate what we think is going to happen, and we can publish that out to the public so they have a better understanding of the risks they're facing. And then finally, the University of Iowa is really doing some neat work as far as 3D visualization. So not doing mapping, but actually showing an illustration of what the flood can look like. So a lot of people really don't understand when they look at a flood map what that means. But most people, when they look at this picture, can understand what that flood level means to them personally. And I think it's tools like this that will help us make better decisions and help us get folks out of the way. So I think I'll end by kind of talking about this group. I think we all, in our work, when we come up with new technology tools, we kind of like to focus on the gee whiz part of it. But my advice to you is really, when you're talking with the emergency management profession, talk about how your tools can save time, because time saves lives in emergency management. That time gives us the ability to get folks out of harm's way and lessens our need to do search and rescues. It helps protect lives and property. And so that's a key focus. I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ted Okada. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at FEMA. I'm actually the first CTO at the executive level in FEMA's history. I started about 3 months before Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, and I just survived 2017 like my colleagues here to my left, and so don't know if I may be the last CTO in FEMA's history. My LinkedIn is absolutely updated, but I appreciate the order in which we presented, because in the U.S. We have a history. We are a democracy. We respect the 10th Amendment, and we are really, as we call it, we operate through organic authorities. So, in a disaster, your first line of help and assistance is your neighbor. And the Red Cross, I think, really exemplifies this sort of ground-up organic authority and their ability as a nonprofit to really be the front line of disaster management. And then, of course, that escalates to both county, city emergency managers, and ultimately to the state. And so I feel that my presentation this afternoon will just simply build on what both Chuck and Mike have presented. So thank you for the privilege. What I'm going to do is actually potentially just give you a little bit of a strategic sort of how the pieces all really fit together. And so I'm not going to duplicate what Chuck and Mike have eloquently just presented, but maybe a couple of things just to think about in terms of how it actually operates here in the US. So when you think about emergency management in a disaster, really the principles are all laid out in the culture that fire rescue and your typical fire department actually bring, right? So in other words, the entire structure, all the way up to the FEMA administrator, all come from a tradition and a heritage of fire operations and fire rescue. So of course, when there's a building fire or a car accident or a minor fender bender, there are always sort of three operational priorities in a disaster. And that is, number one, to secure a scene. And if there's hazard materials, how to isolate and deny access. How to then search for survivors, or unfortunately, if there are victims. We don't always call them victims, right? If you're living, you are a survivor. And finally, to stabilize the scene. Now, here's the challenge. The idea is that in a catastrophic disaster or in a disaster, even for a single fire department, there's this long-standing tradition of mutual assistance, right? We call it a 2-alarm fire or 3-alarm fire, or you get your battalion chief to bring in another department, or you escalate that at the city emergency management office, and then you sort of escalate to the county level, the state level, and of course, when it gets to the state level, FEMA's often, like the state, like the county, like the city, always leaning forward. But there's this tradition of really supporting at the sort of lateral level another department, and then ultimately having the next level up in governmental emergency management support what's happening at the local level. And that's a tradition. The challenge, of course, is how to do it in a large catastrophic disaster like we had in 2017. I mean, the numbers are really staggering, right? So in other words, in 2017, the entire cost to the nation of the 4 catastrophic disasters, including the California wildfires, and I saw the poster presentation by the grad student on the Montecito fires, and well done. Harvey, Irma, and Maria constitute about $265 billion. That is almost as the same amount of money that was the economic hit of Katrina, Wilma, Rita, and Sandy put together. FEMA, actually, when it came to our operational pace, if you sort of measured the last 10 years of assistance we gave individuals, of all the individuals that FEMA provided assistance to, half in the last 10 years were registered in only the last 6 months. So 2017 was absolutely a nightmare year, and we are grateful for the federal family because this was a whole of government approach at the federal level, state, and local level. Some 20,000 federal employees, including, we're grateful for Northcom and General Robinson. There were agents from the FBI, Justice Department, EPA, NASA folks were manning amateur radio stations in what's called the SHARES program. It was really across the board a heroic effort, a Herculean effort really across the federal family. All right, and so that's how you scale. So we look at how our process is ultimately going to be repeatable, scalable, and sustainable. And there's all important issue of accountability, and so it's always the measurable and manageable. So measurable, manageable, repeatable, sustainable, scalable. And that is the great challenge. The only way that can happen is something that Mike already mentioned in his presentation, which is speed and velocity. Velocity is the central feature about that ability to scale, right? We do not get time back in a disaster, full stop. We do not get time back in a disaster. So if that is the case, we have no choice but to, as a former administrator once said here at FEMA, we have to go big, go early, go fast, and certainly be smart, okay? So in doing this, we've always searched, I think, as an emergency management culture, those of us who do international disaster response, for metaphors. And I think this audience here, and I think being in the backyard of MacDill Air Force Base and CENTCOM and SOCOM, one of the folks that we've sort of greatly admired, providing us with a number of metaphors, is a guy named John Boyd. And this morning's presentation, I think, was Steve Fleming, talked about we have to be people first and hardware last, and I'll get to that in a second. But a lot of you guys know John Boyd, a really great biography written by Robert Coram. There are a lot of metaphors out there, but one of the things that he sort of came up with is something that we've sort of used in our practice, and that is the OODA loop, right? To observe, orient, decide, and act. And when we have to scale and we have to do things at high speed and high velocity, processes that are repeatable, sustainable, and scalable, this is a pretty good one. It's not the only one. And I know that Boyd's fairly controversial, and for those who are Marines, they've sort of adopted this Air Force kernel, and I know he's a little bit controversial in the Air Force itself, but on the other hand, he applied a number of thoughts about the notion of speed to action. And so applying that to emergency management, he said, initially when you have a disaster or either an adaptive threat like a terrorist incident or a non-adaptive threat like an oncoming hurricane or a seismic event that is sudden onset, we have to characterize the event. He also talked about a consequence model, and that's effectively in Boyd's thought process, how we orient, decide, and for a lot of us, we look at the sort of the envelope of decision science, how we actually put that together, and ultimately, how do we act and make a decision, whether it's sending fuel, Defense Logistics Agency, or Crowley barges to Puerto Rico, the USVI, or to send USAR teams, Urban Search and Rescue, which was, by the way, in Texas, we actually sortied the largest cadre of urban search and rescue. 26 of the national 28 teams were all in Texas. Full feedback loops and unfolding environment. That's how, and you bring that all in. And as Steve Fleming mentioned this morning, another sort of Boyd quip and a meme was this idea that we are to be people first, idea second, and hardware third. So ultimately for us in emergency management, we look at outcomes. Right? Ultimately, we make decisions ultimately for an outcome for a survivor. That is the highest priority. We are not to feed systems. We are not to build toys. We are not to build things that we find at the Sky Mall catalog and see how they fit in. No, we're actually ultimately to create outcomes for survivors. We may look at policy or ideas that relate to how we actually carry that out and ultimately processes. And so I'm going to park on this for just a second. And this is how we put it together here at FEMA. So on the left-hand column, Boyd's meme of people first, idea second, hardware third, and ultimately outcomes. And what are the decisions that actually lead to the outcomes? What are the analytics? And I think GEOINT would certainly qualify in this sort of general category of tradecraft and ultimately data. We call it data provenance. In other words, what are the sources of data that are ultimately authoritative that you can actually make analytical decisions, and how do we actually separate that layer? How do we manage it? How do we ultimately govern it? And then hardware governance at the bottom. Often in sick organizations or dysfunctional organizations, you'll find everyone serving the hardware. Certainly that was the case in a lot of systems within FEMA. Hardware, effectively is poorly managed. It's at risk in terms of operation and maintenance. You have very bad data or fractured data or incomplete data, null values, missing values, so forth. Bad analytics or no analytics, and ultimately bad decisions. But a decision will be made. The question is will that actually be informed by wisdom? So, you think of T.S. Eliot's great quote, right? Where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge, right? Where's the knowledge we've lost in information? And ultimately, as someone who's been involved in data science, where's the information we've lost effectively in data? But ultimately, it's not so much knowledge management, it's actually the management of wisdom, right? If you go back to the Greek terms phronesis, practical wisdom, or even Sophia, eternal wisdom, what kinds of pieces of wisdom actually begin to drive our actions? Okay, I'm just going to leave with two things here. This is a simple Esri story map. We call it the incident journal. And I want to highlight something here in this, and this is not much different than what Mike has certainly built at the Texas Division of Emergency Management, or what Chuck does with RC View at the Red Cross. Very good friends, I've known them for years. Outstanding work. And this is something that we published internally, but for the very first time in 2017, we put it on we allowed it to be externally viewed. And why was it a little bit sensitive? As Mike mentioned earlier, he's quoting Kenneth Graham of the National Hurricane Center. The fact that you've got, let's say, probabilistic storm surge data based on depth grid bathymetry on where the water actually might occur or be in a catastrophic flooding event. But that's ultimately probabilistic, right? That depends on a lot of things in terms of rain exceedance, concepts like rapid intensification of a hurricane in the last 24 hours. If you look at Hurricane Ike, it was absolutely a sort of de-intensified as a wind event in terms of wind radii, but it was absolutely a surge event. And that's what wiped out Galveston, Texas, when I came ashore a couple of years ago. But it's still probabilistic. At the same time, what we were examining within FEMA was the fact that we had population data. A lot of it came from the Census Bureau. And under Title 13, some of the folks in Census, and I sort of had permission to share this, were a little bit nervous because a lot of the American Community Survey data was probabilistic itself. But here's the point. We sort of, for the first time, put probabilistic data and overlaid that itself on probabilistic data. And that's the central issue about a GIS system. In other words, static maps really assert something about the nature of reality. And it sometimes takes that ability to make that decision out of the hands of the one who's actually making the decision. So in other words, there's a sort of old saying, we pay managers to execute against certainty, but we pay leaders to execute against uncertainty. It's under that unfolding environment, going back to Boyd's OODA loop, that we actually are faced with in terms of actually providing an outcome. So the more we actually put these tools in the hands of a decision maker, senior federal coordinating officer, or a regional administrator, or in fact a governor, or the state director of emergency management, the better we off. Because as they begin to toggle layers off and on, they are then able to effectively understand the consequence and understand the potential outcome, and then sort of allay their cadres to actually effectively respond better. So thanks very much for your time, and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks. Do you need this?
No, I don't. Do you know where the timer is? Is there a timer? You can just yell at us.
Very bottom of the screens. It's hard to see from here.
Okay. Oh, great. Wow, that's really hard to see. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I wanted to start, and feel free to ask each other questions as well, because I know actually only two of us have just met today. But I wanted to start by bringing up something that you said, Ted, about design decision science and the role of good design practices in being able to get people, operators, to make better and effective decisions. How should we be thinking about addressing that in the future? And how should organizations be thinking of that?
That's a great question. I think Mike sort of and Chuck both referred to this idea of gray sky and blue sky, and of course there's black sky, which is when we are in a continuity event, for the nation, in fact, or when we have nation threat, state threats to the nation. And when we sort of break down this idea of blue sky versus gray sky, and you saw my sort of rainbow model in terms of separating the layers. Bad systems tend to be highly verticalized when we look at that. It's helpful to us, at least within FEMA, to separate those issues. So when it comes to UX design, going back to my sort of software design background, we have to start thinking about maybe our interfaces as being more polymorphic if you think about object-oriented code, right? I'm sort of a definition of polymorphism is, I'm a husband to my wife, I'm a father to my children, I'm a colleague to Mike, but I'm still the same Ted. And the question becomes, how do we look at these interfaces under high stress and under duress? What are the ambient cues that we actually build? If you look at the average emergency operating system, you'll see sort of big plasma screens with the Weather Channel and CNN or Fox or et cetera. What I really want is local News 8, right? I need to look at the traffic cams in Columbia, South Carolina when the flooding happened 2 years ago in that state. And am I weaving the design decisions based on something that a contractor built during blue sky with really dense buttons? I come out of fire rescue tradition. I was a volunteer 5 years prior, never even thinking I'd ever join FEMA. Fire guys are, I just want McDonald's. I want a number 1, 2, 3, 4. Give me fat buttons. If there's a way I can actually record an incident with as few buttons because I might be back in service and back on call. So This sort of, I think, this idea that designing for a polymorphic interface might be sort of useful, and we're looking at that right now.
Okay. Did you want to bring up what Red Cross might be doing? Looking forward to that.
I think it gets down to what's the job that we're trying to, or what are we really trying to accomplish? One of the challenges that we face on a regular basis when people want to over-design something or go beyond what the job at hand is, we constantly get when we're coming up with a new system or developing a new system for one of the lines of business, everybody wants a space station, right? And so we end up, building a BMW when maybe what was really needed was a Chevy work truck with tech, but a Chevy work truck. And so it's hard to focus on what is the task at hand and what are we trying to come out with in the best interest of our clients.
And where are the sources of all your data? Is it all open source? Do you share it with other organizations during the disaster?
So perhaps I can answer that or help. And I want to commend a point that Ted made about the Hurricane Incident Journal. It was something that I was going to touch upon. Is I've noticed in the emergency management world, we're all seem to be coalescing on a trend, which is that we no longer need to own all geospatial data. And I think before it used to be the mindset that we would have what I would describe as a Death Star GIS system, where I had to have everything into my system. And now we're kind of moving away from that and really looking at what are the things that I need to own in my shop? What am I responsible for as far as those core data sets that we produce, and then link in through web services to our federal colleagues, to our other state agency partners, our local governments, and then get that information out to the public. And so it's becoming a much more lightweight model that we're trending towards. And so I don't have to have all this into my my system. What I need to do is have good web services and process and procedures set up so that we can adjust this and we can share information as a web service.
Yeah, and I'd like to touch on that too, because it's really a good point, especially where we are right now. If we can acquire data from wherever to help us develop a polygon that says in this portion of town, there's 4 feet of water, okay? It's a game changer what that does for us. So we no longer have to send out people to do a windshield survey and get a general idea, followed by even more people that are doing a detailed house-to-house survey, followed by even more people that are actually making contact with the impacted families. And we just know if we have a neighborhood in that area with X houses at the same elevation, they've all got 4 foot of water.
Well, now in this age of open source, like social media apps and crowdsourced apps, like in Haiti, we saw the use of like Ushahidi and OpenStreetMap and all of this being aggregated. Are organizations really using that, or is it too dispersed? Do we need to have a central location that it's being collated in?
I'll take that on a little bit. I mean, the one thing I love about OpenStreetMaps is, and Mikkel Maron's team is, how they've really sort of expanded even modern concepts in geography, in terms of anthropological models, like, hey, this is how to represent geospatially. I live next to the house that's yellow by the, by the cactus that has 3, next to the mountain that looks like the moon or something like that. And those things are really sort of new concepts in geography. What I love about, of course, OpenStreetMaps is this idea of open source. And one of the points I want to make is that in an age where, obviously cybersecurity is a big issue, if I can inspect the code prior to execution, and I can ambiently introspect it while it is running, I'm going to have a higher probability of it being secure. So this gradual move towards more open source tools is pretty much unstoppable. That's the first observation. And the second point was what Mike Ouimet shared, which is, it is by federal mandate. In 2012, the White House issued the Digital Government Strategy for the United States, which said that all data must be available to the public. And then in 2013, there was an executive order that came out that said not only must it must be shareable, but it must be also machine readable. Well, we had presaged this. I run something called OpenFEMA. So if you go to fema.gov/data/open, we actually published the APIs, right? So this idea that when Mike said, a web services model, it's, to put a fine point on it, it's really API driven or API centricity in this. And so we actually put the sets out there. We provide avenues of public comment. We have XML and JSON and JSON-A data sets that are available, but very much a de minimis set. And the fascinating thing is in 2017, we actually crossed the chasm because more data out of FEMA.gov was sent machine readable for the very first time in having a website than was human readable. There was a small spike when Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, where more humans, actually human readable pages, were consumed by the public. But then we came actually back down. And the reason is, in the early days of Open FEMA, we had typically universities, and we had the press, Wall Street Journal, UVA, Yale University. But now we've got sort of the housing industry and companies like JP Morgan and mortgage-backed security companies. They're now consuming our data and effectively using it. So I think this idea of peer-to-peer, as opposed to, exactly as Mike said, one sort of central repository with tag you're it, FEMA. You've got to build the Uber cloud repository. Those days are long gone. And now, I think even hats off to Mina, I think in some of the work that you're doing, linking the world, very much how do we partner better? How do we collaborate better? Some of the cultural things that you're doing in your NGO. Those are the kinds of cultural values that we are trying to drive for within the federal family as well.
And I'll say I absolutely agree with Ted on that. Really, crowdsourcing is unstoppable, and rather than the emergency management community resisting it, I think that we should embrace it and work with that community to give them feedback on how they can better help us, because we need all the help we can get. During Hurricane Harvey, there was a website started up. It was Crisis Rescue, where we had so many rescues going on, more than we had first responders, and people were coming out with their personal boats to rescue people. And so somebody spun up a website where they made a mobile app that they could, I'm here, I need somebody to rescue me in a boat. Fantastic. You know, that if it gets people out of harm's way, I'm all for that kind of thing. And we just need to work with that community to help us in the future.
There seems to be a lot of these platforms that pop up per disaster, and then it's not sustained, and the agencies that are constantly responding to the same disasters are not working on the same platform. So when the next disaster hits, maybe somebody comes up with an innovative app or platform like that. And then also counties and cities, they're not maintaining their data sets. They're creating geonodes per disaster, and then they don't maintain it. And when the next hurricane season comes around, it's not maintained. How can we incentivize people to continue maintaining these types of data sets? And also to get organizations to share data. There's such a resistance, I think, to share, especially live during a real-time disaster.
Absolutely.
There's a saying, in a disaster is really the wrong time to be trading business cards. So it's also the wrong time to think about, oh yeah, we've got to share data. So it comes back to preparedness. And one of the things that Brock Long, our FEMA administrator, has really done is, in the strategic plan, he's looking at how to create a culture of preparedness and how do we prepare the nation for a catastrophic disaster. For us in FEMA, it's to really simplify the complexity of emergency management. But it's this issue of preparedness. It comes back to training, right? And so don't need to repeat some of the themes that were mentioned this morning about this notion of training, right? And what training actually looks like and the muscle memory that occurs. There's a great book about disasters, if you ever want to read Amanda Ripley's book it's called The Unthinkable, and she goes into the history of 9/11, and then she focuses on simple things like the practical things in a disaster. When you fly in an airplane, you should pick up that little safety card and look at it. And the statistics always show that those who actually pick up the card and actually open it and read it and look at it actually survive in plane crashes at a higher rate. So in other words, those actually begin to train the mind. Being the home of SOCOM here at MacDill, and they've done studies on the MRIs on those who are in the SEAL teams and in SOCOM and Special Forces. Their brains actually map differently because they've been trained to handle the stress. And so use that metaphor that Amanda Ripley brings up, only to say that's what occurs. We have to train the use of data sharing. We have to actually get practice and never waste a good disaster. And certainly what we're going to do is constantly, as long as we have energy, to encourage a increasing culture of preparedness. And places like Tampa here, which barely dodged the bullet, right? Naples, Tampa, when it came to Irma, down in Marathon Key, Monroe County, Isla Mirada. I mean, there is a serious issue about affordable housing for the folks who live there, who work in Key West, and it's very difficult years ahead for them. But you got a lot of people who are operators here. This is operator culture, operator country here, and I think this city could do a lot to actually speak to the world of emergency management and what training actually looks like.
Do you think the politics, though, will start to support more and more preparedness and pre-planning? Because then also on the private side, the funding is very reactive as well. And some of this legacy funding, for example, HUD has funding allocated for homes that are in floodplains, and it will continue to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, but you can't use that funding to actually move these entire communities, even though they're going to get hit year after year.
Ted and I had the opportunity to have dinner last night, and we were talking about this very thing, and really with our situation as a nation, and Ted talked very eloquently about the cascading effects of all the mass incidents we've had over the years, and we're basically funding this through debt. All these, Harvey is a debt-funded incident that our grandchildren will be paying for. And the only way that we get beyond this current mode that we're in is by planning, as you're talking about. We can no longer continue to do business. And so it's been talked about by FEMA administrators and really kind of a warning to the states and local governments that you have to get your act together. You have to start better planning because they have to start, the discussion is really incentivizing planning for disaster management and getting, as you're talking about, getting away from all those repetitive losses and start, and those communities and those states that better plan should get better incentives to help incentivize that whole planning cycle.
Yes.
And we also need to be willing to learn from what we see, and not be stuck in the same mode of doing business. Like social media is changing the way we do business. We were in Puerto Rico in some remote villages trying to bring connectivity to people with satellite dishes on trucks. Very few people used our somewhat dated family reunification system. Once people got connectivity, everybody went to Facebook, right?
Yeah.
So we need to learn from that, and I think that permeates kind of everything that we do.
And there's like an entire industry now set up for disaster response, and yet, and even organizations are set up to wait for things to happen, use the disaster to use as marketing, to get the funding, to do the response, where sometimes it causes unintended consequences. You were talking about speed. What gets lost in reaction and response? What gets lost when you're trading speed for being more preventative? Okay, 5 minutes.
Yeah, so this idea of cognitive load, you think about Daniel Kahneman, right, Nobel laureate, talked in his book, Think Fast, Think Slow. It's one of my favorites, great book. We use it to train our federal coordinating officers. This idea of system 1 and system 2, right? This idea that most of us live in the system 1 world. I buy an iPhone because I think it's cool, because my kids think it's cool. I've got my hipster 20-something-year-old kid who thinks it's super cool, my daughter, and she just loves it. And so I bought it without even thinking, right? The hard stuff is formulas and math, and and that's system 2. We very often don't stop and wait to think and think critically. And so there are a number of metaphors that we use in FEMA. One that I like a lot is one that William Langweisje, who wrote about aviation, wrote in this Vanity Fair story about the horrific crash of Air France 447 from Brazil, where effectively, the lack of when we do things like automation, right? And the money quote from that article was that, we automate things to make things easier, and then we have a catastrophic human failure. And what's the reaction to that? Well, we automate even more, which results in even larger catastrophic failure. And then that begets more automation, begetting more human failure. Until we sort of stop and bringing, again, Boyd's thinking about the human, so cockpit resource management, right? Do we have the ability to peer review? I think those are things that are lost. And I think in the culture of emergency management, where there's so much pressure that you have to execute on your own, in fact, because you pre-scripted and you've got pre-scripted mission assignments that you sort of asserted yourself, you fail to actually have the humility and that hubristic thinking has ultimately failed in actually getting that gut check that you really need. That's often lost in that disaster. And in the fog of sort of war, when you think about that cognitive load, and that's only increasing. Social media has not made it any easier. You can get tools that will filter that out, lots of them out there, but that's a challenge. One thing I just mentioned, Mina, in terms of your question, which is a very good one, which is this idea that let's not waste 2017. There were two professors at Tufts University that looked at child survival and in international disasters, and they came up with this concept called positive deviance and positive deviance modeling, right? Look at what cities have done well and make that the canonical example, right? It's sort of like when the Secret Service or the US Treasury would look at fake $100 bills, right? The idea is that you don't study fake ones, you study the real one for a long time, and then you immediately know what's not genuine. So I think in the case when you look at Texas, they're going to rebuild Harris County. And I think as municipalities, as they build, look at best practices that actually come out. So I think for the next decade, we should be looking at states like Texas, even Puerto Rico, as they come up with innovative ideas in terms of how we actually train and become more resilient.
Sorry, this is very awkward. So, okay, and a question from the audience is, how are your agencies, FEMA and the Red Cross, how are you looking at these new innovations? How can these small companies get some of their tools into your hands and in front of you?
We're expanding our relationships and our activities with our partners. I can give an example in Houston going on right now for Harvey, where we adjusted systems so that the reverse of the way we've done things for years, we would do the intake process with the clients and then filter some information into a separate system that the partners had access to so they could do their types of assistance. And we kind of reverse that. So it's all one system now, and they can enter information on the front end. We can work in parallel. We can be a little bit more efficient about how we do business. And we're looking at doing that beyond just client and financial assistance, but into areas of everything we do. I would love to see a world where we only had one entity doing damage assessment for everybody.
Would FEMA be that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the idea is this idea of just-in-time formation, right? So crowdsourcing is a great example. If we are regularly exercised, we have standardized APIs. There are nonprofits like the National Alliance for Public Safety GIS, or that's Rand Napoli's group, doing a lot of things on resource typing and map symbology. Those are the standards, and the rest is really ultimately going to be a pickup game. If we are well prepared as a nation, this is going to be easier. I think, Mina, the question you wanted to ask was, how does the private sector help? I'm glad Chuck answered the question first, because it's really the nonprofit sector, right? There are, in every disaster, there are organizations like Team Rubicon or Tool Bank. They partner with Walmart and Home Depot. ITDRC, that's Joe Hillis's organization. They're in every disaster, and they can absolutely inline to you. You know, when companies say, "How can we help FEMA?" then that becomes sort of, I got to quote them, the Federal Acquisition Regulations and the Anti-Deficiency Act, and then we go into this big spin. But the idea is really, please help these nonprofits, because they're really at the front line, right? You don't know if you don't go. So one of the best things you can do is just letting people go. During Hurricane Sandy, during the superstorm, Google had this really great idea. They said, for 2 weeks, you don't have to show up to work. We're going to pay your salary, but just go out there and do good. And if you're a typical Google employee, you're already type A, you are absolutely a leader in your field, and probably with a doctorate. And they just did that. They just went through Staten Island and in the Rockaways, and they just helped. And that's good corporate social responsibility in my book. So.
I don't know. I mean, there are teenagers who can't even clean their rooms, and they're going out and trying to rebuild houses. I don't know about that. But yes, there's no such thing as kind of like an InQtel, but for this disaster response industry, maybe? We're out of time. But is there a place that people can go and submit maybe their innovations or understand what the needs are of agencies?
With us, it begins at the chapter level, and we ask that people get involved with your local Red Cross chapter and, be a part of the preparedness and the planning and the thought process that goes into what we do after something happens.
And for us, every governmental agency is different about their vendor contact rules and procurement rules. My agency is actually pretty restrictive, so the only time I can really have direct contact with vendors is at a professional conference like this. So if you're a vendor out there and you're wondering, well, is there value for me coming to a conference like this? This is my opportunity to really have one-on-one conversations with you about your products.
Great.
I'll just end with going back to where I started. We have something called Idea Scale in FEMA, but really, here's a pitch. If you have a chance to volunteer at a local fire department, join a CERT team, learn how to be prepared and be a volunteer EMT or firefighter, please do. There's a sort of overall decline number of firefighters. This is my Fairfax County EMT card. I carry it proudly. And one day when I'm utterly exhausted at FEMA and check in to the hospital after my coma, I'll absolutely come back to volunteer back. It's the atom of emergency management, and fire rescue is a great place to start. And I encourage anybody who's able-bodied to give it a try. It'll be enormously satisfying if you can do that.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here and offering those insights. I think the more we can share data and capabilities and what the needs are, the better we can respond and serve people. And we have we take on the burden of responsibility to do that for on behalf of the United States here. And we shouldn't let 2017 be wasted. We have so many lessons learned, but they're not learned until they're put into practice. So I hope that this starts a conversation. I encourage you to reach out to them with your ideas. And again, thank you all for being here, and thank you as well for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.